Welcome back. In the last video, we looked at JavaScript variables and data types. In this video, we'll look at conditionals and looping. Before we get started with the code, I want to point out that I refactored the demo page we've been working with by moving the JavaScript from the HTML file into its own JavaScript file. Similar to working with CSS, we want to keep HTML in the .html files, CSS in the .css files, and JavaScript in the .js files. So I created a new folder named JS in the root of the project. Then inside of the JS folder, I created a new file named scripts.js. This is the file which will hold the JavaScript for our web pages. Then in the HTML page, I modified the script element to add a source attribute which points to the scripts.js file in the JS folder. This is the preferred way of adding JavaScript to your web pages, and it's the method we'll use going forward. So let's jump over to our script.js file and take a look at the code. As you can see, I've included the use strict directive at the top of the page to force the JavaScript to execute in script mode, and I have a window on load function to prevent any JavaScript from executing until the DOM has been rendered. As discussed in the last video, these are JavaScript best practices. Inside the window on load function, I have a console.log statement, and as we saw in the previous video, any text in the console.log statement is written to the JavaScript console in the developer tools. I just wanted to point out that there are different types of message formats that you can use to write to the console. First, we have console.log, which writes a generic message to the console. Console.info messages take the same format. A console.warn message is shown as a warning, and console.error is displayed as an error. You can use these formats when writing your code to log descriptive and meaningful messages to the console to help with your development and debugging. There's also a console.clear statement which will clear the console when executed. Now, we'll turn our attention to conditional statements. And conditional statements are used to perform actions based on different conditions. So in one condition, we may want to execute a certain block of code. In another condition, we may or may not want to execute another block of code. And the most common conditional you'll come across is the if statement. The if statement is used to evaluate a condition enclosed in parentheses. And if the condition evaluates to true, the code wrapped in the curly braces will be executed. So in this example, I've declared a variable named username, and I've set it equal to an empty string. Then I'm checking to see if the username, and I use the double equal sign for the comparison operator, is equal to an empty string. Then I want to write to the console, hello world. So if I save this code and then run it in the browser, I see hello world because username is equal to an empty string. Here I'm just writing a blank line to the console so we have some space between our output. In this example, I've taken the username variable and I've reassigned its value to foobar. And now I'm using a conditional to check if the username is not equal. The exclamation is the not character. So whereas in the first conditional we were checking for equality, the equal, in the second example we're checking if the value of the username variable is not equal to an empty string. And in this case, the username variable's value is not equal to an empty string because it's equal to foobar. So in this case, if this evaluates to true, which it does, I'm going to write to the console, hello, and then get the value of the username. So let's test this. And in this case, we see hello foobar. Now, in the case of these two examples, we've executed both of these if statements. First, we checked to see if the username was equal to an empty string, and if so, we executed the code in the curly braces. And then we checked to see if the username wasn't equal to an empty string, and then we executed the code inside of those curly braces. Taking that if statement a step further, we can use an if else, where we'll check to see if the first condition in the parentheses is true, and if it is, we'll execute this code, and then we'll break out of the if. If it's the case that this condition is not true, then we won't execute this code, we'll jump down into the else, and then we'll execute this code. So this saves us executing both of those if statements, which is a bit more efficient. We don't have to do the two evaluations. We just do one evaluation. If it's true, execute this code, else execute this code. So let's uncomment these, and we'll go back to the browser, and we would expect in this case to see hello username, because we set username to equal to foobar. So it is the case that the value is no longer an empty string. And when it's executed, we see the result we expected. In this example, we've added an else if statement to our if. So I've declared a variable called visitor counter, and I set its value equal to 100. So what I want to do is I want to check to see if the value of visitor counter is less than 25, then I'll write to the console, not many visitors here. Else, if this isn't true, I want to check to see if the value of the visitor counter is greater than or equal to 25, and check to see if the value of the visitor counter is less than 100. So what we're doing is we're saying that this statement evaluated to false, so I'm going to check to see if the value of the visitor counter is between 25 and 99, because it's less than 100. And if that statement evaluates to true, then we'll write to the console some visitors here. Now, if it's the case that visitor counter is not less than 25, and if visitor counter isn't within this range, then we'll jump down into this else and finally execute this line of code, which says lots of visitors. So looking at the value of visitor counter, which is 100, we know that this will evaluate to false, and we know that the value is not within the range of 25 and a number less than 100, so between 25 and 99. So we would expect to see the text lots of visitors here written to the console, and in fact we do. Now if I were to change this number to 30 and run it, the if statement here would evaluate to false, but the second if, the else if, will evaluate to true. So when we execute it, we see some visitors here. Now I'd like to look at another conditional, which is called the switch statement. And the switch statement is used to check a condition, in this case the value of visitor counter, against multiple cases. So we switch on the value against a particular case. So here we have our visitor counter variable and the value set to 25. So I want to switch on the value of visitor counter, which is 25, against the case of 25. And if the value of visitor counter is 25, which in this case it is, we're going to write to the console, not a lot of visitors here. And then we're going to break out of the switch statement. So as we work our way down the case statements, if the value isn't 25, then we're going to check the next case. And if the value isn't 50, then we'll check the next case. And if it were the case that visitor counter were 100, we would come into here and execute this code and then break out. So as soon as you hit a break statement, you stop checking the cases. Now, if it were the case that visitor counter were none of these values, then we would drop into the default and we would execute this code, writing exactly whatever the visitor counter value is, visitors here, and then we break out. Now, even though this is the last statement in the switch statement, it's still best practice to include the break statement in the default case. So let's uncomment this final line of code and go ahead and execute this and see what we get in the console. So here we see the statement, not a lot of visitors here, which makes sense because visitor counter is 25, we're switching on the value, and we hit the case where the value is 25. Now let's change this to 100, and if we execute this now, we'll come in and we'll check the case at 25. Well, 25 is not equal to 100, so we won't execute this code, and we'll jump down and check against 50. And again, we don't have a match, so we won't execute this code. We'll check against the case where the value is 100. Of course, we'll get a hit here, and then we'll write to the console and break out. So if we execute this now, of course, we see a lot of visitors here. And finally, let's go ahead and change the value so that it is case that the value is not 25, nor 50, nor 100. So since we don't get any matches on these cases, we will drop down to the default and write exactly 1,000 visitors here. And let's just make sure this works, and we see our result as expected. Okay, now that we've taken a look at conditionals, let's focus our attention on loops. And loops are used to execute the same code multiple times, each time with a different value. And pretty much the most common loop that you'll come across is the for loop. And the for loop allows you to execute the code inside of the curly braces as long as the condition specified inside of the for loop definition is true. So the for loop has the syntax of declaring a variable to use as the index. So what is the starting point in the loop? Then you check the condition to see if it evaluates to true, and then you increment the index. So for this forced for loop, I've created a variable named index, and I set its value equal to 1. And as long as the index is less than 11, I'm going to execute the code inside of the curly braces, which is to simply console.log the value of the index. Then after I finish execution of the code inside of the curly braces, I jump up here and I increment that index. So what I'm doing is I'm saying set the index equal to the current value of the index plus 1. So the first time through this loop, index is 1. We'll check the condition to see is index less than 11. Well, sure, 1 is less than 11. So we'll execute the code and write the current index is 1 to the console. Then we'll come up and we'll add 1 to the index. So the second time through the loop, the index is 2. Is the index less than 11? Of course. So we'll write that again. And we'll keep going until we check the condition. If the index is less than 11, execute the code in the for loop. So let's go ahead and save this and execute this in a browser. And we'll see that the current index started at 1 and it kept going until it was 10, because clearly 10 is less than 11. Now, this second example is similar to the first one in that we set our index to 1. In this case, we're checking to see if the index is less than or equal to 10. So really, it's the same case as the value less than 11. Well, if the number's less than or equal to 10, then it's clearly less than 11. And then we've modified the way that we increment the counter using a shorthand. So in the first example, we said set the value of the index equal to the current value of the index plus 1. What plus plus does is it says get the current value of the index, add 1 to it, and then set that value as the value for the index. So again, the first time through the loop, index is 1. Is 1 less than or equal to 10? Sure it is. So we'll write to the console. Then we'll index plus plus, which makes the index 2. And again, 2 is less than or equal to 10. So if we run this, we see the same results, 1 through 10. And then in this last example of the for loop, we've taken a different approach, and we're going to print the numbers out in reverse order. So in this case, we're starting with the index of 10. As long as the index is greater than or equal to 0, write to the console, and then index minus minus. So decrement the value by 1. So we'll start with 10, we'll write to the console, we'll subtract 1, index is 9, 9 is still greater than or equal to 0, and we'll keep going until the index is no longer greater than equal to 0. I'll save this, refresh the browser, and now we see we start at 10 and work our way down to 0. The next loop we're going to look at is the while loop. And as long as the condition evaluated in the parentheses is true, we will execute the code within the curly braces. So while this is true, execute this code. Now, when you write the code for your while loop, you have to be sure that you have code that will change the value of the conditional to make it false. Because if you never make this condition evaluate to false, you'll never break out of the loop, and you'll have what's known as an endless loop. So what I've done is I've created a variable called index, and I set its value to 0. I have a variable max, which is 10. And then I have a Boolean variable named keep looping, which is set to true. Now, while the evaluation of keep looping is equal to true, console.log the current value of the index. And then I'll check to see, is the index less than the max? And if that's the case, I'll increment the index. Then if that is the case, I don't drop into the else because this evaluated to true. So I'll come back up and I'll check the conditional again. Well, is keep looping still true? Well, sure it is, because I didn't go into the else statement, which said set the value to false. So as long as the index is less than the max, we start at 0 and the max is 10, increment and come back up and check the condition. As soon as the index is no longer less than max, I'll drop into the else statement and I'll set the value of keep looping to false. Then when I come up and evaluate the statement again, keep looping will be false. This will not evaluate to true, and I'll exit the while loop. So let's take a look at this in the browser. So here the index started at 0. That's because we set the index to 0. And we went through the loop until the index was 10, because we checked to see is the index, which in this case at this point in the loop is 10, less than the max. Well, no, the max is 10, so 10 equals 10. So we jump into the else, we set keep looping to false, the condition is no longer true, and we exit the loop. The final loop I'd like to look at in this video is the do while loop. The difference between the while loop and the do while loop is that the do while loop will always be executed at least once. So the syntax is do the code inside of the curly braces while this condition is true. So we do this once, then we check the condition. And if the condition is still true, then we'll go up and do it again. Now, like the while loop, you have to be sure that you have code that will make this condition evaluate to false, or else you never exit the loop. So in this example, I have index, which I've set to 10. I will log out the value of the index, and then I'll decrement it. Then I'll come down and check to see if the index is greater than or equal to 5. Well, it will be the first time through the loop because we start at 10, subtract 1, and we keep going until this evaluates to false. So if we look at this in the browser, we see index starts at 10 and it decrements down until index is greater than or equal to 5. And then when we come back up and decrement the index, it's no longer greater than or equal to 5, we exit the loop. In the next video, we'll continue looking at loops, but we'll apply them to objects and arrays.